Greetings all, Ferrari-Man 601 here. Welcome back to another 1/18th scale model car review of this from Mini Chaps, the Jordan 191 as driven by Michael Schumacher and others in the 1991 Formula One season. The Jordan 191, it is a very interesting car, not in the sense of, well, it did cool things in the era, which it did, to be fair, but more so in the sense of the cult classic, the cult favorite that it has become since its competitive days. Yes, Jordan Grand Prix, unfortunately, very unfortunately, in my opinion, a team that is no longer with us on the Formula One grid, but they were a stalwart of Formula One through the 1990s, and they even not quite lucked their way in, but hard worked their way into a very legitimate, although a little bit of a long shot, charge for the championship in the 1999 season. So Jordan were a very respected and respectable team in their era. Unfortunately, times did not quite keep up with the finances of Eddie Jordan and his ability to attract favorable sponsorship for the team. And 2005, unfortunately, was the last year that we would see the Jordan name on the Formula One grid, although 2004 was the last season that Eddie Jordan personally had much to do with the operation of the team. The Jordan Group would be sold off to Midland for 2005. They still competed as Jordan for 2005, but for 2006, we had Midland Grand Prix on the grid. They didn't even last the balance of the season before they were sold off to Spiker. So we had Spiker Formula One on the grid at the end of 2006 and the entire 2007 season. For 2008, they became Force India. Force India eventually being sold off in 2017 to become Racing Point out of Canada, and Lawrence Stroll getting involved with that consortium there. Racing Point at the end of the 2020 season being sold off to Aston Martin, also owned now by Lawrence Stroll. So no change in the team ownership, but a change in the team branding. So now Aston Martin Grand Prix is the name that we associate with the entry that was once Jordan Grand Prix. I think there's some bureaucratic nonsense involved there in terms of Aston Martin technically not being the same entrant as Jordan. However, it is the same grid slot that was once occupied by Jordan Grand Prix, a really cool heritage of this team. And it all boils down to one convenient fact, that one Michael Schumacher made his Grand Prix racing debut with Jordan Grand Prix all the way back on one August day in 1991 at Spa-Francorchamps, driving the Jordan 191. So let's take a look at my 1/18th scale rendition thereof. We'll take a look at the overall configuration and complexity and some of the Easter eggs about this wonderful Grand Prix car of yesteryear. We'll talk a little bit more about the design and mechanical layout of the 191, and we'll talk a bit about the many drivers who sat in the cockpit and drove this thing in anger, including the elephant in the room, Mr. Michael Schumacher.
The Jordan 191. It's a car really on its face that should not be all that notable. It was the first Jordan Formula One car, yes, that is true. However, think of the other teams that are currently on the grid even today. The first Mercedes Formula One car, when they returned to Formula One in 2010 anyway, that car, nobody talks about the MGP W01 anymore, do they? Despite Mercedes going back and winning many a Constructors' Championship in their career since. But we do still talk about the Jordan 191. Why? Well, it doesn't have all that much to do with the car itself, although it was a respectable car, all things considered, particularly as a team's first effort, and particularly as far as minnow teams in Formula One go, they tend to be toward the back of the grid. That was not the case for the 191. However, it's not so much the story of the 1991 season or the story of the 191 itself that gives it its notoriety. It's the story of what happened to the team that designed it, as well as one of the drivers who drove it, despite it being the driver who had the shortest tenure behind its wheel. What is the Jordan 191, though? Well, it is a Formula One car that was designed and built by Jordan Grand Prix for the purposes of competing in the 1991 Formula One World Championship. It was the first Formula One car built by Jordan, and it was their first entry into the Formula One World Championship. Jordan had made their name in lower formulas leading up to the 1991 Formula One Championship, but 91 was when they were going to break into the big time and give it a shot at Formula One. This is the car that they came up with, that technical team headed up by Gary Anderson, who today is now a Formula One pundit. And he gives some great commentary, not only on the sporting activities that we see in Formula One, but his technical analysis, being a Grand Prix car designer, are absolutely second to none. Highly recommend watching anything put out by Gary Anderson. He was assisted in his design of the 191 by Mark Smith and Andrew Green, who were the directors of mechanical design and structural design, respectively. The car has no predecessor, at least not in Formula One, because this is the first Formula One car built by Jordan. However, it was succeeded in 1992 by the aptly named Jordan 192. This car being known as the 191, however, that was not a foregone conclusion. You may find some literature about Jordan Grand Prix and their new Grand Prix car for the 1991 championship being referred to as the 911, the 911. Why would this car have a name like that? Well, that was its initial name. Eddie Jordan had unveiled the car at Silverstone in a very striking black and gold livery, bearing the name 911. Do you remember any other very famous car that's called 911 or 911? Porsche, yes. Well, Porsche took a bit of a dim view of Jordan Grand Prix using the 911 moniker and promptly threatened to sue Eddie Jordan, team principal of Jordan Grand Prix, of course. Eddie Jordan turned around and said, okay, we'll change the name of my car even though it's going to be so distressing for me in order to do this. So, you think maybe we could get some sort of a deal? So the deal was Jordan changed the name to 191. And Porsche gave Eddie Jordan a new 911. So there it was. That's how politics in motorsport works sometimes. Eddie Jordan gets a new car, and the Jordan 191 becomes known as the Jordan 191. However, enough politics behind the car. What is it? How did it tick? 1991. This is a long time ago. This car is 32 years old. Surely we're talking about some sort of cast iron, pig iron construction here. Nope. Still a carbon fiber monocoque. Carbon fiber came into Formula One in 1981 with the McLaren MP4-1. Yes, that car. And very famously got its first real stress test when John Watson had an enormous accident at Monza. The car disintegrated, but John Watson popped out and he was no the worse for wear. So carbon fiber had come and it was going to stay in Formula One beyond that time. And here we are in 1991, 10 plus years later, and we've got carbon fiber honeycomb composite monocoques here on a Formula One car. And that was the case up and down the grid by this point. What we have here in terms of mechanical layout, though, basically the same, if you could believe it, as a modern car, and of course basically the same as cars that we have looked at prior on the channel, particularly cars from the 90s and 2000s. I mean, not all that much has changed, even though this is a 32-year-old car. The mechanical layout here is very similar, almost identical in a lot of respects. The suspension on the car, as you can see there, it's a bit wider, a little bit more spindly than what you see nowadays, but it is, what? A double wishbone pushrod suspension, front and rear. So you've got that same commonality between what you have on a modern car, at least in the front suspension, and what you have on this one from 32 years ago. Pretty remarkable. However, something works, something works. Time is no variable there. What is powering the car, though? That is a bit of a difference. The engine, it is longitudinally mounted as you would expect, just like you see on a modern Formula One car. However, what is it in its specification? Well, it is a Ford HBA-4. It is a 3.5 liter V8. Yes, big V8 engine in this. I believe that the Ford HB series of engines is actually an evolution of an evolution of an evolution of the Cosworth DFV, the double four-valve engine that was designed by Keith Duckworth back in the 1960s. So, we have got, effectively by this point, a 30-year-old engine in the back of what is now a 32-year-old car. However, that Cosworth DFV and then the other iterations that it went through in its competitive lifetime, an absolutely rock-solid engine, and we're still using a variant of it here in the 191. It is a V8 at 75 degrees, mounted longitudinally, of course, and it is naturally aspirated 3.5 liters displacement. What are we making in terms of power output? about 600 to 650 horsepower, revving out to 12.5 to 13,000 RPM. Really great sound out of that engine, and of course, a lot of cars ran Ford Cosworth V8s even in this era, so there is no shortage of reference material online if you want to get a sense of what these engines sounded like. They're absolutely wonderful. Lots of gurgly power in the lower revs, and then they go up into a rather dissonant whine in the higher revs, but very dramatic to hear. And of course, a lot of horsepower and therefore a lot of performance. That torque, though, was going through to the rear axle via what sort of a drivetrain? No semi-automatic sequentials here, although that was on the Formula One grid beginning in 1989 with the Ferrari 640. The rest of the grid really had yet to develop and adopt the technology. In fact, in 1991, it was only Ferrari and Williams who were running the semi-automatic gearbox. Everybody else still running a traditional H-pattern manual, and that's the case here on the 191. We have a 6-speed Hewland manual gearbox hooked up to that Ford V8 in the back, and then thereby hooked up to the rear axle, delivering that 650-ish horsepower to the ground. Absolutely great stuff. And of course, in its era, you wouldn't have thought anything remarkable about it because, well, most race cars of the era were going to have a manual gearbox, and, well, the Formula One car was no different. But today, to benefit from another 32 years of technology and evolution, and then, of course, to apply 32 years of hindsight to this is just so pure. It's not simplistic by any means, and we'll get into some of the really cool things that were going on this car, particularly from an aerodynamic standpoint, but it's just the visceral sort of analog direct connection between driver and machine. It's got a gear lever and a steering wheel and 3 pedals, and anything else fancy that happens in the middle, that's all coming from the thing between the driver's shoulders. Yes, his brain and his experience going to be making this car tick, and that's something that we have gotten perilously far away from, at least in Grand Prix racing since this era, and I really hope that we would make a return to this. Therefore, it turns this car into a bit of almost a quasi-religious sort of relic, because, okay, it's not unique in terms of its stablemates on the grid, but it is one of those cars that it's evocative. Look at the shape of it. Look at the colors, the 7-Up livery. And of course, we have the Michael Schumacher connection with this car, the absolutely enormous elephant in the room that we haven't really mentioned yet. Michael Schumacher started his Formula One career at Spa-Francorchamps in 1991, deputizing for Bertrand Gachot in this car. And the rest is history. 7 times world champion, the first guy to win more than 5 world championships, Michael Schumacher. This is the car that gave him his first start in Formula One. Absolutely remarkable. What else about the team, though? Well, it was only fielded by Jordan Grand Prix in 1991, and it was driven by, in addition to Michael Schumacher, we had Bertrand Gachot in the number 32 car, as we see here. Michael Schumacher, of course, deputizing for him at Spa. Also driving the number 32 car was Roberto Moreno and Alessandro Zanardi. Yes, Alex Zanardi, a driver of the Jordan 191. And in car number 33, for the duration of this season, Andrea De Cesaris. So, De Crasherus, as a lot of people like to call him. No. De Cesaris was a very respectable Grand Prix driver, and he also drove the Jordan 191. So we have got some very famous names. We have got Moreno, Schumacher, Zanardi, De Cesaris all driving this car, and that's yet another reason why it has achieved cult legendary status today. Again, it's not so much in terms of what the car did, but who did what in it, and then what those people and this team did afterwards. In terms of the car's actual competition history, though, it didn't set the world alight, but it wasn't bad either. It's a little bit murky sometimes to track the specifics because we had this car shared by 5 different drivers at different points throughout the season. But at the end of the season, it did manage to score 13 World Constructors' Championship points, which sounds absolutely abysmal in a 2023 perspective, but that was 5th in the Constructors' Championship in 1991. So a brand new team, a brand new car, a little bit of a radical design as well in some respects, finished 5th in the Constructors' Championship its first time out. That is really remarkable. The car's best result is 2 4th-place finishes, courtesy of Andrea De Cesaris. That happened at Canada and Mexico. Yes, the Circuit Gilles Villeneuve, as well as Hermanos Rodriguez in Mexico City, the same places that we still visit today for the Canadian and Mexicans Grand Prix, the same circus that we know with minimal changes, really. Fourth place, both by De Cesaris. He followed that up with a sixth place in France, as well as a fifth place in Germany. So, yeah, respectable things by the 191. So it's not a car to sneeze at, yet it isn't one that really gained a whole lot of notoriety simply by its results. Again, it's about the people and places and the who, what, where, when, and why that gives this car the status it now holds. Taking an overall look at the 191 here, what do we have going on? Well, we do see some pretty radical departures, particularly when we look at this in the context of a modern Formula One car. However, for its era, this was also a very interesting design, mostly just from a general shape perspective. Yes, we were seeing basically a universal application of the overall aerodynamic ideas that we're going to be talking about in more detail here on this car, but things like the shape of that engine cover and air snorkel, as well as the rear wing treatment on this car, little bit unique, and they are quite distinctive today in terms of being some of the signature traits of the 191. However, ultimately, what are we trying to do with this car? We are trying to do two things. We are trying to cut down on drag, and we are trying to increase downforce using the under tray. These early 90 Formula One cars and the late 80s ones that immediately preceded them, they were more or less ground effect cars. No, we did not have things like big underbody tunnels, not like the mid to late 70s from cars like the Lotus 79, probably most famously being a true ground effect wing car. But we are still very heavily utilizing ground effect here in the early 90s in Formula One design. The undertrays of these cars are completely flat. They did not feature the legality plank down the center, nor did they feature the step plane and reference plane. It is all just a flat under tray on these cars, which means that you can run them really close to the ground, and when you run an aerodynamic surface, a wing in particular, when you run a wing really close to the ground, you cause the air traveling underneath it to accelerate if it wants to move a given volume in a given amount of time. Which means that when you accelerate that flow, it exerts a lower pressure on an adjacent surface, and that's your downforce generation. That's the overall philosophy of these cars. They're ground effect cars, really. It's just that we don't tend to think of them as such, but they are. They're nowhere near as efficient at ground effect as, say, a Lotus 79 with a sculpted under tray that is effectively turning the whole car into a wing, and the entire rear is a gigantic expansion zone, diffuser if you like. But we do have the same overall idea happening on cars like the 191 and basically all the other early 90s Formula One cars going up through 1994. So that's what we've got here. We're used to talking about in 2023 the return of ground effect to Formula One, and people talk about the 80s being the last time Formula One used ground effect. No. 1994 really was the last time that we saw ground effect inspired, anyway, Formula One designs. However, going back to what we see here specifically on 191, the front end, first of all, and you can see just this classic shape here. It looks absolutely phenomenal, first of all, from an aesthetic standpoint. But what we have here, we have got a very simple but still rather unique front wing here. First of all, it's enormous relative to the wings that we would see after 1994 in particular, where they really started to clamp these things down to cut the downforce levels. But here we have got this very broad, very wide front wing, which does have some interesting characteristics to it. This initial leading edge, you can see how it is flared upward here toward the center. Remember when we took a look at McLaren MP418 and they were doing something like that on their front nose and front wing? Have a look at the Jordan 191 doing effectively the same thing, but 12 years earlier. That's pretty cool, I've got to say. And they're doing it for the same reason. Get the airflow started at the front end so that we can feed the under tray as we head rears. Remarkable stuff to see this far back. However, what else do we see? We have got this neutral section toward the outboard part of the wing where we have this flap, which of course we'll take a better look at when we go nose on, but we've got a flap here with a slot gap as well. We have got very large triangular end fences here, and we have a little vortex generator on the bottom surface of the wing. So in a lot of respects, we're doing very similar things to what we would do later on. However, they just look a little bit different. They're a little bit cruder in some respects, but they're still very sophisticated, all things considered. And again, a lot of the ideas that we have seen on subsequent Formula One cars, they're not new at all, just slightly different takes on very old designs. So very interesting to see all of that. As we head to rears, you can see the pickup points for the front suspension, double wishbone push rod as always, pretty much. And then we start to get into the cockpit area. You can see just how exposed the driver's going to be in this cockpit, and we've got this left front wheel that's blocking a lot of it for the moment. But you can just see where the driver's head is going to be, basically right about at this level. So the driver's going to sit pretty high, sits relatively upright, and he's very much exposed. And in terms of driver protection, there wasn't a lot in this era. Yes, these cars were carbon monocoques, and yes, compared to a lot of other types of race cars of the era, they were very safe, but compared to what we've gotten in later years, not much. And the driver's head being very exposed is one of the vulnerabilities on a car like this. But going back a little bit more toward the snorkel, here it is, the air intake snorkel up here, part of the engine cover, and then it just seamlessly integrates into the engine cover, moving rearward. Absolutely wonderful. We have got little bulges here in the engine cover to accommodate the rear of the intake plenum and top of the valve covers there on the engine. Really, the intake plenum in that area is where we'd be concerned the most. And then it continues to slope down over the gearbox casing and then out to the rear wing support struts. Really nice stuff there. As we move down, you can see we do have side pods on the car. They're pretty slim and they're nowhere near as built up as a side pod on a more modern car, but it is a side pod, and what does it do? It houses radiators, electronics boxes, telemetry boxes in some cases, things like that. Basically, things that either need to be cooled or things that are used in cooling. So radiators are housed in the side pods, and you can see the big inlet duct here for that radiator intake. Moving to rears, this is not the reference plane. It looks like a reference plane because it is the edge of the floor, but that's all it is. It's just the edge of the floor. There's no step underneath this monocoque here, which means that this is your floor. It is running extremely close to the ground, as you can see, and we do still have a whole bunch of freeboard space from the ground up to the top of the side pod, as well as this inboard cutout with our space to play with. And what are we doing with this? We're not quite feeding the diffuser per se. There is no pass-through into the center section of the car directly here. We are entraining air around the inboard side of the car to sort of skirt around the rear axle to cut down on the drag caused by that big wheel and tire flying around in the airstream, which I suppose you could say is a crude form of inwash. But what we're doing here is really just getting the air shunted away, and then with the diffuser flow, we're just going to have it accelerate out the back. But we're not feeding the diffuser per se. We do feed the diffuser in an interesting way on this car, but it doesn't really have anything to do with this freeboard space to play with inside inboard of the rear axle, unlike on a lot of other Formula One cars that we've looked at. But there it is, this profile on 191. It's really, really remarkable to look at this car and realize it's 32 years old and, well, it's still pretty relevant in a lot of regards. From nose on here at 191, absolutely wonderful shape of this thing. Isn't that cool? Absolutely love that. Just this continuous curve from the nose tip all the way up to the cockpit. It's great. This is something that I understand why Formula One got away from, but at the same time, it's just timeless. Absolutely classic. I love the proportion. Anyway, though, that front wing, you can see now quite starkly what we're doing with this upturn as we head inboard toward the center line. What are we doing? We're feeding the under tray. That's absolutely it. Everything that we have seen subsequent in terms of raising the nose tip and mounting the front wing on pylons, or in the cases of cars like MP418 from McLaren with doing this similar sort of thing in terms of raising the height of the main plane to feed the under tray, it all comes back to this idea. We want to get appendages out of the way of the airstream if we're not immediately going to do something with that air in terms of direct downforce generation. We want to start to route that air inboard down the center line where we can split it out later on. absolutely remarkable that Gary Anderson had that sort of foresight in 1991, because this became a really critical area on the cars forevermore. It still is today, even though we once again have mandatorily low nose tips. Teams are still trying to find ways around this, and this is what Gary Anderson and Jordan decided to do all the way back in 1991, and it worked. So absolutely remarkable stuff. However, what else do we have going on here apart from that front wing? We have got ourselves our front suspension, which we can see. We have got a wishbone push rod. And then, of course, on the other side, we have got the same thing going on. Really cool. And then on either side of that, you can see where we have got our radiator inlets right through there on the side pod. So that's cool stuff. Returning to the front wing for a moment, though, you can see that, of course, we have got the raised center section by the nose tip, but we start to come down again. And what are we doing when we come down again? We have got this slot gap. Here's our main plane, our flap moving the rears with a little gurney on top. And then we have got this slot gap. Why do we have this slot gap? Well, we're accelerating air through a gap. In other words, we're forcing its speed to increase as it goes through the gap, because we can't have it stall, right? This interfaces with our lower wishbone for the suspension, obviously, but this flow also interfaces with a vortex generator and a little bit of an outwash generator, a little bit of an outwash winglet that is on the trailing edge of the front wing that we can't quite see from this angle, and that is then going to start working in conjunction with the side pod design. Number one, to intake a little bit of air into the side pod, but also to entrain the air to the side of the side pod and then start to blow that gap between the rear axle and the center line of the car that we took a look at in the previous segment. So all of that thinking starts right here on the front end. You can see how the whole car is functioning homogeneously as one aerodynamic element. That is a hallmark of a very good design. It's also a hallmark of a design by somebody like, Adrian Newey. His philosophy is to treat the car as one homogeneous aerodynamic element. Gary Anderson doing the same thing here on the 191 all the way back in 1991. Really, really remarkable stuff. From the right side here on 191, what do we have going on? We'll start with our front end once again, and quite plainly you can see what we're doing. We have just got this triangular end fence. We have no sort of sculpting of the end fence, so we don't have any outwash geometry going on here. It's just a flat panel. However, what we do have trailing here, we have got a vortex generator that is extending back from about this point to about this point. So entirely inside the track of the front axle there, if we include the wheels, and it is working in conjunction with the leading edge of the side pod here, right at the edge of frame. And that is partially how we're feeding the gap between the center line of the car and the rear axle. So all of that starting at the front wing. Otherwise, though, we're not doing anything else with that end fence. Moving back toward the center section of the car, though, here we are. There's the cockpit area. You can see here is the top of the chassis, right here, top of the monocoque. Sometimes there might have been a windscreen here, other times not, but you can see just how high the monocoque is in relation to the top of the driver's head, which would be about here. So the eye line out of this car, probably a little bit challenging depending on a seating position. So I'd imagine that's something that they would really have to work on with, again, in this case, 5 different people drove this car competitively. So I would imagine that there was a lot of work done at the factory making sure that the drivers were absolutely comfortable, because bit of a visual obstruction right here, honestly, in terms of the chassis design. But as far as I'm aware, nobody ever had any issues with that, so it's all well and good. Another illustration, though, of just how different the cockpit geometries are nowadays. This is our cockpit surround, and it's not a cockpit surround. This is not that crushable collar that we talk about nowadays that we've had since the mid-90s. That's just carbon. That's the side of the monocoque. Nothing deformable or crushable about that. And the driver's head and neck largely above it anyway. So in the event of a big lateral impact, the driver's head is just going to deflect over the side, and that could be a bad day. So just completely different in terms of the design philosophy as far as safety was concerned in this era. Also, a really stark illustration of this. This is the steering wheel right here. We are able to see the steering wheel from looking at the car 90 degrees side on. Never in a million years would you expect to see that on a Formula One car nowadays, but that's just how exposed the cockpits were in this era for the most part, and that's what we see here on 191. It just is what it is. Nobody thought about these things in the ways that we think about them today, and it's not to say that people were being reckless, but it's just the way that things were, and nobody really questioned it, and quite thankfully there wasn't much of a reason to question it in this time. Unfortunately, 1994 came and luck ran out, and lessons were learned, and changes were made. But this is what it was in the era, and it worked for the time being. Continuing, though, as we move down in the center section of the car, you can see we do not have any barge boards here. Barge boards were a thing here, but not quite universal, and as you can see, they were not on the 191 in any regard. Lotus, on cars like the 97 and 98T from 1985, 1986, they did run a very small, crude barge board in the center section of their front end, basically in the area where you'd expect to see barge boards, but it was not a universal. It didn't really catch on yet, and therefore we don't have any here on the Jordan. You'll also look at cars like the Ferrari 640 and 641, the Williams FW14, FW14B, no semblance of barge boards either. So it was a thing, but it wasn't something that people really saw the potential in yet, so they didn't really exist for the most part. What we do have, though, is just very quiet, clean, unencumbered lines. We have an under tray. We have a sort of vestigial, or primordial rather, T-tray in this area. You can see this is the head. This is the head end of the diffuser right here, and it comes down in that T shape as you would expect, and then it flares out with our side pods, the outermost point of the side pod right here. Here's our inlet, and then we just have a very clean, straight across axis here across the top of the side pod. So real cool stuff to see. We're not trying to manipulate the air too much as we head over top of the side pod. As you can see, it's just straight and level for the most part, and we are just trying to get the car through that airstream as efficiently as possible. So there's no use of winglets here, there are no chimneys, nothing like that. Just nobody was thinking along those lines quite yet. But you can see the beginnings of it. We are exhausting some of our radiator flow right out through here. This is not a chimney, it's just a duct, and the high-speed air coming through the radiator would just be thrown out the back through there. So that is pretty cool. And we're using that flow a little bit to sort of create a slight blowing effect toward either the upper wishbone of the rear suspension, or to send some of that air further inboard to the center line on our rear wing. We have a center element right in here where that could start to come into play a little bit. But for the most part, we're just trying to get that hot air out of there. It's not doing anything for us anymore. The engine cover geometries, though, really love all of that. The two things about this engine cover that make it for me, we've got this open curving shape in the rear of the cockpit, and then it comes down in this nice curve toward the rear wing, punctuated by the little blisters here for clearing the back of the intake plenum there on the engine. That is really cool, and again, looks absolutely distinctive, and it's something that's instantly recognizable as, 91 Jordan. Cool. There's our rear wing. Very simple end fences. We weren't playing with the end fences basically at all in this era, but you can just see what they're doing. They're there simply to hold the wing together. We have got slots and adjuster holes there for our various brackets and setting positions for where the main planes could be. We have 3 main planes on this rear wing. It is a triple-decker gantry wing, basically, and it's, again, something very unique, and from the rear we'll see that a whole lot better, of course, but very unique rear wing and rear end treatment in general on this car. Here, though, lower side of the side pod, you can see the geometry that we have here. Just the very severe cut inboard towards center line. There is our free space on the floor. And then we just start to accelerate that flow inboard and out to the rear end. And that's basically all we've got here on the right side of the car that's readily apparent anyway. You can see also just how low the car is close to the ground. That has everything to do with the aerodynamic efficiency here. Again, we don't have a legality plank, we don't have a step plane, so we can get this thing as close to the ground as possible for the maximum aero benefit. In this era, particularly at the start of the race, because just like modern Formula One, there was no refueling during the race in this era either, The cars were really heavy. They were running as low as they could, which meant that they were going to be scraping the ground a lot. Lots of sparks and dust being thrown up by these guys at the start of the race, and a lot of sacrificial parts as well because of that. We would have titanium or magnesium skid blocks along the under tray. You would have the same along the front wing end fences in a lot of cases. The very famous video of Senna and Mansell fighting at Catalunya in 1991, where you see both cars just shooting out tons of sparks from their front wing end fences. That's what's going on. Those sacrificial parts are just burning away as the cars are going to slowly experience an increase in ride height as the fuel load burns down. Some other teams, Ferrari in particular, they actually ran wooden skid blocks on the front wings as a sacrificial part. They were cheap and easy to make, and they were just going to be burned up anyway. Really cool stuff. Very dramatic pictures from the cars of this era, and that's just why they came to be. We ran them as low as possible, we were scraping the ground, and we had the side effect of those glorious spark shows. Taking a look at the rear zone on 191, and what do we see here? Well, really, the biggest thing that punctuates this view of the car is that diffuser expansion zone, and just look at how enormous this is. First of all, we need to distinguish a couple of areas here. This area just north of where we've got these tunnels underneath, this is simply exhaust for hot air out of the engine bay. Some of your radiator exhaust coming through here, some of your bypass from the snorkel is coming through here. Basically, we are just venting all of the hot out of here as efficiently and as quickly as possible, because obviously we want to keep things as cool as we can, lest we run into reliability issues. Below that, though, we have got these two absolutely enormous central tunnels, and this is another hallmark of the 191. This was a pretty unique diffuser. McLaren also ran something that was not the same as this, but similar enough to this. McLaren just had a big central tunnel exiting out the back of the MP45B of 1990. However, they did not follow up that design on the MP46 of 1991. So this car having a really big expansion zone doubled up in its diffuser. Why is it doubled up though? Well, we also on this car have something that has been a bit of a theme in these model car reviews lately. We have a blown diffuser. Yes, 1991, we have an exhaust blown diffuser. The exhaust, we can't quite see them here, but they exhaust out of the top valance here of the bottom of the floor inside the tunnel. So obviously we have a V8 engine, two banks of cylinders, we have our 4-into-1 collector pipes on each side, and then they come down and converge out the back. So that is where we are sending the exhaust gases. We are energizing the flow that has passed underneath the car, and now it's reached the expansion zone of the diffuser, which means that it's going to slow down and expand. And when that high pressure, high speed flow slows down and expands, its pressure drops yet more, which means we create downforce out the back of this car. Also helping with some downforce generation, we have got this bypass area that is inboard of the rear axle. We talked about when we were taking a look at the side pods from other angles, so you can see what we've got going on here. But there's no attempt to integrate this flow with the exhaust of the diffuser. It's just running in parallel out the back underneath the rear wing end fences. So that's interesting to note. But we have also got this rear wing, and you can see this triple element rear wing. Something very distinctive, something that would be incredibly illegal in modern Formula One, but here in the 90s the designers were allowed to be designers and the engineers were allowed to be engineers, and we had novel designs like this. So triple main plane wing, each one of these is its own completely independent flap element. You could angle these independently of each other, you could choose to run one, choose not to run another, and all sorts of combinations were available in the setup of the car. And that's what they've got. Very inefficient in terms of what we would now consider to be optimal aero in 2023, but for the time, it worked, and it did exactly what it was supposed to do. It simply was there to add a little bit of extra downforce to the rear end, really to trim the car, because again, most of our downforce coming from the under tray, even in this era of a somewhat sanitized but still pretty effective ground effect, as we have demonstrated with the underbody profile and the expansion zone of the diffuser on this car. So really cool to see all of that. And again, running your exhaust through here means you can blow the diffuser. It also means that you keep the top side of the car clean. We really didn't see periscope style exhaust yet in this era. Again, that was something that Ferrari basically pioneered all the way in 1998. Remember, we're in 1991 here. But in the meantime, we did have teams running their pipes out the sides and out the back, or at the center and out the back. Basically where you see the rain light, some teams ran their exhaust in this area to either side of the rain light. That was also a viable solution, but not Jordan. They decided that we're going to do something with that high-speed flow out of the engine, and we're going to use it to augment the flow that's already pretty substantial out of our diffuser. So that's really cool. A blown diffuser back here in 1991, it was the convention, I would say. Most teams had some figment, some element of a blown diffuser. Not all, but many did. It was not a new idea even at this point, and it certainly was not a new idea by the time we saw it again in Formula One in 2011. So there it is. Blown diffuser, another hallmark of the Jordan 191, in conjunction with that very distinctive triple rear wing. And for the sake of continuity, taking a look at the left side here on 191. The car, of course, is fully symmetrical left to right, so nothing on this side that we haven't already seen the analog of on the right side. However, just again, quick pan overview of that absolutely wonderful shape, completely unencumbered by any extraneous appendages, particularly in the cockpit area. Yes, not the safest thing by modern standards, but just that shape is something incredible. That side pod detail, again, you can see that duct where we're just unceremoniously hurling the radiator exhaust out back into the atmosphere. Absolutely great. Really, really it is. Also, you can see that nice wheel and tire detail going on here. Again, nothing spectacular, but it's there. Big Goodyear slicks. Goodyear, that's a name we haven't seen in quite a long time in Formula One, but there it is, and they look absolutely great, do they not? Just wonderful stuff. Absolutely. Real cool. Taking a look here, midsection of the car. Wonderful to see all of this. Again, no barge boards or anything like that, but completely free and clear of any obstructions. Really nice. Really, really nice. That flow going into the upper elements of the under tray, really. Not feeding that diffuser, though. A big departure from cars that would follow this one. And again, that really, really low ride height. You can just barely pick out that gap between the bottom of the side pod and the ground. Really remarkable to see all of that. It's a wonder that they were able to make these cars work sometimes. They were running so low. But again, run the skid blocks and things like that, and you'll get away with it as long as that fuel burns down somewhat quickly. But really just very, very nice proportions on everything here. Really, it's one of those classic shapes that never gets old. Now going freehand here on 191 to take a little bit of a look at some of the details that perhaps we couldn't see from further out. First of all, there's that front wing. You can see overall what we're doing with the shape of this, how it comes up in the center, and you can see where the nose tip is recessed a bit. So the farthest forward surface on a car is that leading edge of the front wing, much like we had really on MP4-18, which is an interesting parallel to make between those two. One somewhat unexpected, really, but there it is. You can also see what they're doing with that upper flap and the slot gap that's formed between the upper flap and the inboard surface of the end fence. Really, really cool stuff. You can also now see, if we go above, you can see these little vortex generator winglets that are trailing the front wing. And now you can finally see the full context of why that slot gap is there. We are feeding air toward these little vortex generators. Again, we are completely shielding that lower surface of the front suspension from any turbulence from the front wheel inwash. So that's really cool. And as we track rearward, you can now see what's going on with that surface of the side pod there, extreme lateral flank of the car. That's what we're doing. So you can basically draw a straight line from these vortex generators all the way out to the rear zone of the car. That is some cool stuff right there. Of course, we're doing the same on this side, and the outboard surface of that vortex generator, a little bit harder to see, but it is there.
Additionally, on our front suspension, double wishbone pushrod as we discussed. However, you can see the brake duct as well on the inner surface of that front wheel. Real cool. And inside there, you can even see the brake caliper. Really nice to see all of that. Like that a lot. Nice detail here, mini chaps. Anyway, though, there is our front suspension. Carbon look on some of those shrouds. Pretty much untreated plastic in other sections, but still looks the part. Do like that. And then the top of the monocoque. Big hatch down the center for accessing things like the dampers and the pedal box and the steering column and things like that. The monocoque, it treated some things a little bit differently in this era. Things like the steering column were not necessarily integral to the monocoque. They were freestanding, mounted on brackets in some cases, and it was designed to be quickly serviceable. Nowadays, a steering column change on a Formula One car is a little bit more involved, a little bit more time-consuming, but here they were basically designing these components to be accessible from the top, as you could see here with this big hatch down the center of the monocoque, basically the entire length before the cockpit area. Getting into the cockpit area, first of all, there's the inboard center section of the front end. No barge boards to speak of, but there is our radiator inlet on the forward face of the side pod, and then into the cockpit itself. Two little mirrors on either side. They're mirrors, what more can you say? Our air snorkel, and then our driver's area. First of all, the big black section you can see at the back, that is just a cushioned area to keep the driver's head from smacking into the back of the monocoque too much. And then the cockpit itself. There's the seat. We've got seat belts that are molded as part of the seat, but they're there. And then we just have the steering wheel. No paddles on the back because there were no paddles in this era. Remember, manual gearbox, but just a more or less a traditional looking automotive seat in here. Obviously, it's a race car seat, but it's there. Nothing too much to see. And then just your steering wheel with some buttons on it for radio and probably an emergency engine kill. And then we do have a dashboard that is detailed in there as well, but we won't quite see that from this angle. But that's it. It's pretty simple, all things considered, because that's just what the state-of-the-art was in this era. We didn't have too much in the way of sophisticated electronics, things of that nature, and it was just the driver's seat with a gearbox, 3 pedals, and a steering wheel. That's it. Nice shape, though, on that engine cover and that rear wing. And you can see that channel area now where we're feeding that inboard surface of the floor, the top side of the floor, inboard of the rear axle. Nice. And just so many very nice shapes all over this car. It doesn't have a bad angle, I must say. Looking into the cockpit from the right rear, now you can see a little bit more of what's going on inside. We have got ourselves a dashboard. Nice little LCD unit with just a linear digital tachometer. Probably would show a little bit more information depending on page settings and things of that nature, but we can totally see where a tachometer display would be. And then the steering wheel itself looks like we have, how many buttons would you say? 5? Yeah, maybe 5 buttons on there in total, which would probably be, one would be radio, one would be engine kill, and then you probably have another couple of buttons for dash settings, and that's about it. You would have an anti-roll bar adjust on probably the left side of the bulkhead, and then on the right side of the bulkhead, you'd have your gear lever, which I'm not entirely sure if we can get in to see at this point. But, be a gear lever right there, next to the driver's right hand, where obviously you'd be doing your shifting. And then that's it for the driver's controls. Again, nothing particularly complicated in this era because it's just not what it was. It was analog. It was pure, unadulterated driving in this era. And again, I wish that we could get back into that in a lot of respects. A manual Formula One car would be such a novelty nowadays. I really do think that perhaps it's something that we should try again. But I don't make the rules, unfortunately, because Formula One would be a lot better if I did. Anyway, we have got our engine cover. Again, those nice blisters like that. Shut line. Nothing opens on the model, of course, but you can see a shut line there, at least partially. That's nice. Decals look really nice on this one, too. Very, very cool. Very, very cool indeed. And then there's your rear wing. Slot gap between the main plane and the flap. And then the other elements. So very cool. There's carbon fiber texturing on the lowermost element. I suppose you might be able to call this a beam wing, but it is a flap. It's a full flap, not like a more modern beam wing where it's almost bifurcated. So very nice. And again, that novel triple element gantry winglet design, something that we just do not see anymore. Strut supporting the rear wing, integrating the rain light, that's in there. And then of course our diffuser, our main tunnels underneath. That is something spectacular. And then our exhaust outlets are down in here. You may just be able to pick them out. Just maybe. But there they are. Very, very cool. Huge blown diffuser. Huge rear tires. This was a great era for Formula One. Just aesthetically, but I mean the performance was there too. These cars were quick. They really were. The Formula One cars didn't really get quicker than this post 1994 until almost 2004. It was a big hit once 1994 came and the events of that year ensued and they slowed these cars down. It was a while before these guys clawed back all of that lap time, but eventually they did, and then they far exceeded it. But yeah, these were serious cars, despite the relative simplicity that we may think of when we hear manual gearbox in a Formula One car, but they were something to behold. And again, the lap times, they held up for quite a long while. But things have to move on, and they did, of course, in the world of Grand Prix racing, but all the more it makes a car like this, with an appearance such as this, so much more spectacular. Just look at it. It doesn't have a bad angle anywhere. Absolutely great thing. And finally, the under tray on 191. Have a look at this for a novelty. Completely flat. No reference plane, no step plane, none of that stuff. Just completely flat, unadulterated ground effect style downforce. Really, really cool. Obviously, we've got our front end back through here with our front wing, those vortex generators trailing the front wing, and our front suspension mounts. No keel to speak of, because again, this area on the car is basically touching the ground, so anything protruding from the underside of the monocoque would be a bad idea. So we're just mounting things directly to the side of the monocoque in terms of our suspension elements, and then we just flare outboard when we get into our under tray proper and our diffuser. But just completely flat, and then we get to our expansion zone out the back. There are the tunnels, there are our engine exhaust outlets blowing into the tunnels. Absolutely wonderful stuff. And you could just see the airflow as it would be compressed through the center section of the car and then expand out through the trailing edge of the diffuser expansion zone. Absolutely remarkable stuff. Really it is. In terms of model details, there we go. 118, made in China. And then, of course, Paul's Model Art Mini Champs. Jordan Ford 191 1991, and this great carbon look on all of the surfaces on the under tray. So there it is, yeah, the under tray of a 1991 Formula One car. Not something we get to see all too often, but you can see how much more simple it is compared to what we have today, but how much more effective it was as well. If you took this and you just cut some tunnels on the outboard surfaces here and here, you'd basically have a modern Formula One under tray. Really, really cool to see how some things come back in the great cycle that is history.
So there it was, rendered in 1/18th scale by Mini Champs, the Jordan 191 from the 1991 season. Like we saw off the top, it's a car that on its face really would not be all that remarkable. Sure, it would have eventually found its way into the fleets of some moneyed collectors, and perhaps we would have seen it at historic track days, or maybe even racing at the Boss Grand Prix level. But because of a couple of people involved in its development and its competition, guys like Gary Anderson, Eddie Jordan, of course, and the one time that Michael Schumacher drove this car in anger, the car had its reputation inflated a little bit. 2 fourth-place finishes in a team's first year in Formula One, nothing to sneeze at by any stretch of the imagination. But when the guy who made his debut in this car went on to become, up to 2020, the greatest Formula One driver in the history of the sport, well, that really does mean something. So the Jordan 191, it has, I suppose, only appreciated in its value, not just monetarily, I'm sure, but in terms of the value that we as fans place on it, place on its history, and continue to place on its reputation, which still is kind of semi-active nowadays. A couple of years ago, Mick Schumacher, son of Michael Schumacher, he drove this car out at Silverstone. I remember he drove it, and I think the car has had a couple other outings. I think only at Silverstone, but the car has had several outings since, in the hands of Mick Schumacher, in the hands of Karun Chandok, who was shooting a feature for Sky Sports about it. So we have seen this car running in more recent memory. I do think that there is at least another chassis for a grand total of 2 active Jordan 191s out there in the world. No, they don't compete anymore anywhere, but they are in running order, and we do see them at places like Silverstone for the Grand Prix. They do a historic run before the race quite often, and you'll see a lot of classic Formula One cars. The Jordan 191 is sometimes among them. So it is still a car that does exist in running order, more or less as we would have seen it in 1991. So it is now a bit of living history. It is something that more people can experience. And of course, it just continues to perpetuate the legend that really is Jordan Grand Prix. It was a little team that managed to accomplish quite a bit in its time, including fighting an honest fight for the 1999 Constructors' Championship. Of course, they came up short relative to Ferrari, but they took 3 Grand Prix victories in the 1999 season, and they had a good car, and they had a really cool driver in Heinz-Harald Frentzen, who really was also in a bit of a long shot to be driver's champion that year, too. So Jordan Grand Prix, this little team from Ireland, not a place that we really associate so much with motorsport, they came to the fore in their time in Formula One, and it was a great story, and it was really cool to see the Jordan name on the grid back in days gone by. But it all started here in 1991 with the Jordan 191, this iconic classic shape and an iconic history now, forever immortalized, forever associated with one of the greatest talents motorsport has ever known. Here it is, the Jordan 191. A fantastic addition to any 1/18th scale model collection is this Mini Champs rendition. Very nice build quality all around, as you have seen. Everything is where it should be. Nothing looks out of place or disproportionate in terms of size or location. Great paint, great construction overall. Really a fantastic motor car, both in reality as well as here in 1/18th scale. Until next time, though, I do thank you all very much for watching. Ferrari Man 601 saying thanks, and of course, we will see you soon.